cold weather makes you sick? It sounds so obvious, so natural, so unquestionable that most people never even think about it. You wake up, feel the chill in the air, and instinctively reach for a jacket. Someone nearby says, "Don't forget, you'll get sick." You've heard it since childhood. Maybe your parents said it. Maybe your teachers repeated it. Maybe you've even said it yourself to someone else without thinking twice. But what if I told you this belief, one that feels so real, so logical, is actually built on a misunderstanding? Cold weather does not make you sick. And the moment you truly understand why, it changes the way you see your body, your environment, and even your own thoughts. Let's pause for a second and think about this logically. If cold air actually caused illness, then people living in the coldest places on Earth would constantly be sick. Regions with freezing temperatures, snow-covered landscapes, and long winters would be full of people struggling with illness all the time. But that's not what happens. In fact, many people who live in colder climates adapt incredibly well. Their bodies function normally. They go outside, work, exercise, and live their lives without constantly being sick just because it's cold. So something doesn't add up. And when something doesn't add up, that's where curiosity begins. Because the real cause of illnesses like the flu or the common cold has nothing to do with temperature itself. These illnesses are caused by viruses, microscopic organisms that spread from person to person. Experts like Anthony Fauci have consistently explained that respiratory infections are driven by viral transmission, not by exposure to cold air. Cold air doesn't generate viruses. It doesn't suddenly create illness inside your body. It doesn't flip a switch that makes you sick. So why does it feel like it does? Why do so many people get sick during colder months? This is where things start to get interesting, because the answer isn't simple, but it is powerful. When temperatures drop, human behavior changes. People spend more time indoors. Doors and windows stay closed. Ventilation decreases. You're in closer proximity to other people for longer periods of time, at home, at work, in public spaces, and that creates the perfect environment for viruses to spread. Now imagine this scenario. One person in a room is carrying a virus. Maybe they don't even know it yet. They're talking, breathing, maybe coughing slightly. Tiny droplets containing the virus enter the air. In a well-ventilated outdoor space, those droplets disperse quickly. The risk of infection decreases. But in a closed indoor space, those droplets linger. They circulate. They build up over time. And the longer you stay in that environment, the higher your chances of exposure. This is one of the key reasons illnesses appear more frequently in winter, not because of the cold itself, but because of the environments we create during colder months. Organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization have long emphasized that respiratory viruses spread more easily in close contact, poorly ventilated settings. But here's the fascinating part. Your brain doesn't naturally see that. Your brain looks for simple patterns. It notices that two things happen at the same time: cold weather and increased illness, and it connects them. Cold comes, people get sick. Cold must be the cause. It feels logical. It feels obvious, but it's not accurate. This is something known as a cognitive shortcut, your brain's way of simplifying complex information so it can make quick decisions. And most of the time, that works in your favor. But sometimes, it leads you to believe something that isn't true. Now let's go even deeper. Because cold weather does influence your body, but not in the way most people think. When you're exposed to cold air, your body starts working to maintain its core temperature. Blood vessels near your skin constrict to preserve heat. Your body prioritizes keeping your vital organs warm. At the same time, the air you breathe becomes colder and drier. And that dryness matters, because your respiratory system, especially your nose, plays a crucial role in defending against viruses. It traps particles, filters air, and helps remove harmful substances before they can enter deeper into your body. But when the air is dry, those protective mechanisms don't function as efficiently. Your nasal passages can become drier. Mucus, which normally traps viruses, may not work as effectively. This creates a slightly more favorable environment for viruses to enter. Notice the difference here. The cold is not the cause of illness. It's a factor that can influence conditions, but it doesn't create the problem. It's like opening a door slightly wider, but the virus still has to be there to walk through it. And this is a critical distinction, because once you understand this, you stop blaming the wrong thing. But there's another layer to this, one that most people completely overlook, and it has nothing to do with viruses or temperature. It has everything to do with perception. Think about the last time you were out in the cold. You felt the chill on your skin. Maybe your nose started running. Your throat felt a little dry. Your body reacted in completely normal ways to the environment. But what did your mind do? Did it stay neutral, or did it start telling a story? For many people, the moment they feel those sensations, a thought appears. And that thought feels real. It feels like a prediction, but it's actually just a learned belief. Your brain has been trained, over years of repetition, to associate cold sensations with illness. So the moment you feel cold, it activates that belief automatically. And once that belief is activated, it starts influencing how you interpret everything else. A small sensation becomes a warning sign. A normal reaction becomes a symptom. And before you even realize it, your brain has created a narrative. This is how powerful beliefs can be. They don't just exist in your mind, they shape your experience. And this is one of the reasons this myth has survived for so long. Not because it's scientifically accurate, but because it feels true. It matches people's experiences. It aligns with what they've been told. And once something feels true, it's very difficult to question it. But this is exactly why understanding the truth matters. Because once you begin to question one belief, it opens the door to questioning others. And that's where real awareness begins. And once you begin to question this one belief, something interesting happens. You start noticing how often your brain creates connections that aren't actually real. Because the idea that cold weather makes you sick isn't just a random myth. It's a perfect example of how human thinking works. Your brain is constantly trying to predict outcomes. It looks at patterns, experiences, and repeated messages, and then builds shortcuts to make life easier. But those shortcuts aren't always accurate. They're just efficient. And in the case of cold weather and illness, that shortcut has been reinforced for decades. But now let's go deeper into the actual science, because this is where things become even more powerful. Viruses are not affected by your belief system. They don't care what you think. They follow biological rules. When a virus enters your body, it doesn't instantly make you feel sick. There's something called an incubation period, a window of time where the virus is inside you, multiplying quietly, without obvious symptoms. This period can last anywhere from 1 day to several days, depending on the virus. So imagine this. You're in a crowded indoor space, maybe a bus, an office, a classroom. Someone nearby is carrying a virus. You inhale tiny particles without realizing it. At that moment, nothing happens. You feel completely fine. The virus begins its process silently. Then, a day or two later, you step outside into cold weather. You feel the chill, maybe a slight discomfort, and then symptoms appear. Now your brain connects those two moments: cold weather, illness. But the truth is, the process started long before that. This delay between cause and effect is one of the biggest reasons people misunderstand how illness works. Because humans are wired to connect immediate events, not delayed ones. And viruses take advantage of that misunderstanding. But there's more. Recent research has shown that certain viruses actually survive longer in colder, drier environments. This doesn't mean cold creates the virus, but it does mean the environment can support its spread. In dry air, respiratory droplets evaporate faster, turning into smaller particles that can stay in the air longer. That increases the chance of inhalation. At the same time, people are breathing the same air repeatedly in enclosed spaces. So now you have three factors working together: closer human contact, poor ventilation, and air conditions that support virus survival. And suddenly, it looks like winter is the cause, when it's actually the combination of these hidden factors. This is why understanding mechanisms is so important, because once you understand the mechanism, the illusion disappears. Now let's shift perspective again. Think about people who work outdoors: construction workers, delivery workers, athletes training outside in cold conditions. They are exposed to cold air regularly. If cold air truly caused illness, these individuals would constantly be sick. But that's not what we see. In many cases, they are just as healthy, or even healthier, than people who spend most of their time indoors. Why? Because their environment reduces prolonged exposure to concentrated viruses. Fresh air, open space, movement, these factors matter more than temperature. And this is where the myth begins to break apart completely, because it shows you that the problem was never the cold itself, it was the context in which cold occurs. Now let's talk about something even deeper: how your brain reacts to expectations. When you expect something negative to happen, your brain prepares for it. It increases awareness, it scans for signals, it becomes more sensitive. And this can actually change how you feel physically. If you believe cold weather will make you sick, your brain becomes hyper-focused on any sensation that might confirm that belief. A slight throat irritation becomes a warning. A small drop in energy feels like the beginning of illness. And the more attention you give these sensations, the stronger they feel. This is not imaginary. It's a real interaction between your mind and your body. Your brain influences perception, and perception influences experience. This doesn't mean you can think yourself sick in a simple way, but it does mean your expectations can amplify or reduce how you interpret physical signals. And that's powerful, because it means part of your experience is not just physical, it's psychological. Now let's bring this back to everyday life. Think about how often people say, "I knew I would get sick. It was so cold yesterday." That sentence feels like confirmation, but it's actually a conclusion based on incomplete information. It ignores everything that happened before: the exposure, the environment, the incubation period. It focuses only on the most noticeable moment, and that's how myths stay alive. Not because they're proven, but because they're repeated and reinforced by experience. But once you understand this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. You start realizing that many health beliefs are built the same way: simple explanations for complex processes, comforting answers for things that are harder to see. And once you begin to question those explanations, something shifts. You stop reacting automatically. You start observing more carefully. You begin asking better questions. And that's where real understanding begins. But we're not done yet, because there's still a major piece missing from this puzzle, something that connects everything we've talked about so far. And it has to do with how small daily habits, things most people ignore, quietly shape your risk of getting sick far more than temperature ever could. Now let's bring all of this into real life, because this is where most people finally start to see the truth clearly. Imagine two different people. The first person spends most of their day indoors. They wake up, go to work in an office, sit in meetings, share the same air with multiple people for hours, then come home and stay inside again. The second person works outdoors. They're exposed to cold air regularly. They move around, breathe fresh air, and are constantly surrounded by the same enclosed environment. Now ask yourself this: which person is more likely to be exposed to viruses? Most people instinctively say, the one in the cold. But in reality, it's often the opposite. The indoor environment, where air is recycled, where people are close together, where ventilation is limited, is a far more effective space for viruses to spread. And this is something many people completely overlook. Because cold is visible, you can feel it, you react to it, it triggers discomfort, But viruses are invisible. You don't see them. You don't feel them entering your body. So your brain gives less attention to them, even though they are the real cause. This is one of the biggest reasons the myth survives. Your brain focuses on what it can sense, not what actually matters. Now let's look at a very common real-life situation. You're in an office during winter. The windows are closed. The heater is running. Everyone is sitting close together. Someone nearby has a mild cough, but it doesn't seem like a big deal. Hours pass. You breathe the same air over and over again. Then, 2 days later, you start feeling sick. It's because of the cold weather. But the real exposure didn't happen outside. It happened inside. And this is where understanding changes behavior. Because once you realize this, you start making different decisions. Instead of just focusing on staying warm, you start thinking about airflow. You might open windows occasionally, even if it's a little uncomfortable. You become more aware of crowded spaces. You start paying attention to how long you're in close contact with others. And these small changes can have a much bigger impact on your health than simply avoiding cold air. Now let's take another example. Think about public transportation during winter. Buses, trains, airplanes, enclosed environments with many people sharing the same air. If even one person is carrying a virus, the chances of it spreading increase significantly, not because it's cold outside, but because of how the environment is structured. And yet, when people get sick after traveling, they rarely blame the environment. They blame the weather. This shows you how deeply this belief is ingrained. Now let's go even further. There's another behavior people have during cold weather that unintentionally increases their risk. They touch their face more often. When your nose feels cold or runny, you're more likely to touch it. When your lips feel dry, you touch them. When your hands feel cold, you bring them closer to your face. And every time you do that, you create an opportunity for viruses to enter your body, especially if your hands have come into contact with contaminated surfaces. This is something most people never think about, but it plays a real role. Again, the cold isn't directly causing illness. It's influencing behavior in subtle ways that can increase exposure. Now let's talk about another powerful factor: fatigue. During winter, people often feel more tired. Days are shorter, sunlight is reduced. Energy levels shift. When you're tired, your body may not respond as efficiently to challenges. Your routines might change. You might move less, go outside less, or neglect habits that support your health. And all of these small changes add up. But instead of recognizing these factors, people simplify everything into one idea. It's the cold. And that simplicity feels comfortable, but it hides the truth. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Think about people who say, "Every time I get cold, I get sick." At first, that sounds convincing. It sounds like evidence. But if you look closer, you'll notice something. They're not tracking all the times they were cold and didn't get sick. They're only remembering the times when both happened together. This is called selective memory. Your brain highlights experiences that confirm your beliefs and ignores the ones that don't. So over time, it builds a story that feels consistent, even if it's incomplete. And once that story is strong enough, it becomes your truth. But truth isn't based on how often something feels right. It's based on how accurately it reflects reality. And reality, in this case, is much more complex than a simple cause and effect relationship. Now, imagine what happens when you start seeing this clearly. You begin to question automatic assumptions. You stop accepting explanations just because they're common. You start looking deeper. And that changes everything. Because now, instead of reacting based on fear or habit, you're responding based on understanding. And that shift doesn't just apply to cold weather. It applies to your entire approach to health. You start asking, what's the actual mechanism behind this? What evidence supports this belief? Am I reacting to facts or to patterns my brain created? And those questions lead to better decisions. Because there's another layer, one that connects everything we've talked about so far to something even bigger. And it has to do with how multiple small myths combine to shape the way people live their daily lives, often without them even realizing it. Now that you've seen how one simple belief can be misleading, let's take it a step further. Because the idea that cold weather makes you sick doesn't exist alone. It's part of a whole group of beliefs, small, everyday truths that people rarely question. And once you start noticing them, you realize something surprising. Many of them are built the exact same way. Let's start with one you've probably heard countless times. Drinking cold water will give you a cough. It sounds familiar, right? Someone drinks something cold, and suddenly there's a warning. Be careful, you'll get sick. But just like cold weather, cold water doesn't create viruses. It might feel uncomfortable for a moment. It might cause a temporary sensation in your throat, but that's not the same as causing illness. And yet, the belief persists. Why? Because again, your brain connects timing, not causation. If someone already has a developing infection and drinks something cold, their symptoms might feel more noticeable. That sensation becomes linked to the drink, even though the real cause was already present. Now let's look at another one. Going out in the rain will make you sick. This is another deeply rooted belief. Rain feels cold. It's uncomfortable. You might get wet. Your body temperature might drop slightly, and it creates a strong sensory experience. So if you get sick afterward, your brain connects the two. Rain, rain sickness. But just like before, rain doesn't create viruses. The actual cause still comes down to exposure, environment, and transmission. Now here's where it gets interesting. When you combine these beliefs, cold weather, cold drinks, rain, you start building a system in your mind. A system where anything associated with cold becomes dangerous. And once that system is in place, it begins influencing your behavior automatically. You avoid certain things. You become cautious in situations that may not actually require caution. You build habits based on fear rather than understanding. And over time, those habits feel normal, but they're not necessarily accurate. Now let's take another common belief. If you don't wear a jacket, you'll get sick. This one is especially powerful because it often comes from authority figures, parents, caregivers, people you trust. And when something is repeated to you from a young age, it becomes deeply embedded in your thinking. But again, not wearing a jacket doesn't introduce a virus into your body. It might make you feel uncomfortable. It might make you feel cold. But discomfort is not the same as illness. And this distinction is critical. Because once you blur the line between discomfort and danger, your brain starts reacting to harmless situations as if they're threats. And that increases unnecessary stress. Now, let's bring all of this together. What do all these myths have in common? They all involve something you can feel. Cold air, cold water, rain, temperature changes. Your senses pick up these experiences immediately. But the real cause of illness, viruses, is invisible. So your brain gives more importance to what it can feel, even if it's not the true cause. This is one of the most important insights you can take from this entire discussion. Your senses are powerful, but they are not always accurate indicators of cause. They tell you what's happening in the moment, not what caused it. And if you rely only on what you feel, you can easily misunderstand what's actually going on. Now let's connect this to something bigger, because once you start seeing how these myths work, you begin to understand something about human behavior. People don't just believe things because they're true. They believe things because they're repeated, because they're simple, because they match their experiences, and because they've never been given a reason to question them. But once you start questioning them, something shifts. You begin to see patterns. You begin to notice how often assumptions replace understanding. And that awareness changes the way you think, not just about health, but about everything. Now imagine the long-term effect of this shift. Instead of reacting automatically to every situation, you pause, you think, you ask yourself, what's actually causing this? Is this belief based on evidence or just repetition? And those questions lead to better decisions, because now you're not just following advice, you're understanding it. Now let's bring back the main idea. Cold weather does not make you sick, but your environment, your exposure, your habits, and even your beliefs all play a role in how you experience health. And once you understand that, you stop focusing on the wrong factors. You stop fearing things that don't need to be feared. And you start paying attention to what actually matters. But we're not finished yet, because there's one final piece that ties everything together. A perspective that not only explains this myth, but helps you break free from many others. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. What started as a simple belief about cold weather has revealed something much deeper. It's not just about temperature. It's about how easily the human mind creates meaning, even when the connection isn't real. And once you see that, you start realizing something powerful. This wasn't just a myth about getting sick. It was an example of how your brain builds your reality. Think about it. From the moment you were young, you were told certain things over and over again. Wear a jacket. Don't go out in the cold. You'll catch a cold. At the time, those statements were meant to protect you. They came from care, from experience, from tradition. But over time, they became something else. They became unquestioned truths. And when something is repeated enough times, your brain stops analyzing it. It accepts it. It stores it as fact. And then it uses that fact to interpret future experiences. So when you step into the cold and later feel sick, your brain doesn't ask questions. It says, "See, I was right." But now you know something different. You know that what feels right isn't always what is right. And that realization changes everything, because it gives you the ability to step outside your automatic thinking, to pause, to question, to understand. And once you start doing that, you begin to take control in a completely new way, not by following rules blindly, but by understanding the system behind them. Now let's bring everything together clearly. Cold weather does not create viruses. It does not directly make you sick. What actually matters is exposure. Being around infected individuals, spending time in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, touching contaminated surfaces, and then touching your face. These are the real pathways through which illness spreads. Organizations like the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention emphasize these factors because they are based on evidence, not assumptions. And once you understand this, your focus shifts. You stop worrying about stepping outside for a few minutes in the cold. You start paying attention to the environments you're in. You become aware of how long you're in close contact with others. You think about airflow, hygiene, and habits. And those changes, small as they may seem, have a real impact. But beyond all of that, there's something even more important. It's the mindset you develop. Because once you break one myth, you gain the confidence to question others. You begin to see how often people confuse correlation with causation, how often simple explanations replace complex truths, and how easily beliefs spread when they're never challenged. And that awareness is powerful because it protects you not just from misinformation, but from making decisions based on incomplete understanding. Now imagine what happens over time. You start applying this thinking to other areas of your life. Nutrition, fitness, health advice. Everywhere you look, you begin asking, what's the actual evidence? What's the real mechanism behind this? And that changes the way you learn. It changes the way you decide. Because now, you're not just reacting, you're understanding. And understanding leads to better choices. Now think back to the beginning. The simple statement, cold weather makes you sick. It sounded convincing. It felt true. But now you can see it clearly for what it is. A shortcut. A simplified explanation for something much more complex. And once you replace that shortcut with real understanding, the fear disappears, because fear often comes from not knowing, from uncertainty, from believing something might harm you without fully understanding how. But when you understand the system, the fear loses its power, and what replaces it is clarity, confidence, control. So the next time you step outside into the cold, notice how different it feels. Not because the temperature changed, but because your understanding did. You're no longer reacting based on a myth. You're observing reality. And that's a powerful shift. Now here's something to think about. If something as common as this belief can be misunderstood for so long, what else might you believe that isn't entirely true? What other ideas have been repeated so often that they feel unquestionable? And what would happen if you started examining them the same way? Because this is just one example. There are many more. Beliefs about food, about exercise, and each one has the potential to either guide you correctly or mislead you completely. That's why this matters. Not just for this one topic, but for how you approach everything. Because the goal isn't just to replace one belief with another. It's to build a way of thinking that helps you find the truth for yourself. And that's exactly what this channel is about. Breaking down the myths your brain believes and replacing them with understanding. So you're not just informed, you're aware. And awareness is what leads to real change. If this made you rethink something you've believed for years, then you're already moving in the right direction. Because the first step isn't knowing everything. It's being willing to question what you think you know. And once you do that, everything starts to open up. This is just the beginning. There are many more myths your brain believes without even realizing it. And one by one, we're going to break them down. So you can stop guessing, stop fearing the wrong things, and start understanding what actually matters. Follow Brain vs. Myths for more. Because the biggest battle isn't outside. It's inside your mind, between what you've been told and what's actually true.